We're going to start off with Katie Cross. I'll just briefly introduce her here. So Katie Cross is Christ College lecturer in practical theology at the University of Aberdeen, Scotland. Her research interests include trauma and feminist theologies, very appropriate here right now. Together with Karen O'Donnell, she has edited 2 volumes, Feminist Trauma Theologies, Body Scripture and Church in Critical Perspective, that was SCM Press in 2020, and Bearing Witness, Intersectional Trauma Theologies, also by SCM, and this is forthcoming in 2022. Has it just come out? Yes. Yes, just been dropped. Excellent. So she's also the author of The Sunday Assembly and Theologies of Suffering. This is from Routledge in 2020. And and the paper title is right there. So we shall go from there. Thank you.
Thanks, Kirsty. It's really good to be here. How do you follow that? How do you follow that? I want to say thank you, first of all, to Kirsty and Holly for inviting me to do this, and also to Press Red, to Matt and Emily for an absolutely incredible performance. I think we've all felt the weight of that in the room. So it's quite something to follow that up, but I'll do my best. The paper that I wrote for today, which some of you may read, and some of you may have read it, some of you might not have, was based both on previous research that I have done myself, which is on Christian relationships and purity culture. You'll notice I'm not a biblical scholar, for which I apologise. I am a theologian, but there is lots of crossover in my work with what's already been spoken about today. I also based the paper on my reading of the play Control. So I had the script that Matt very kindly sent to me. I hadn't seen it. That was my first time seeing it as well. So Matt's going to come up in a bit and speak a bit more about the play, and I will say a little bit more about the contents of my paper. I feel the need to add an extra layer of content warning to this little discussion that I'm about to have, though, just a few kind of particular content notes and things to be aware of. So as you'll understand from having seen Control just now, I will be mentioning discussions of domestic abuse, physical violence, rape and sexual assault, coercion and verbal abuse as well. So please do look after yourselves. If you are still feeling a little shaky from the last hour of your life, I won't be offended if you need a moment just to take a breather, whether you're online or in the room. So the main question that I had for this paper was, how do some theologies contribute to and even vindicate or encourage domestic abuse in Christian culture? So how do some theologies contribute to and vindicate domestic abuse? And I have done some previous research on this, previous qualitative research. And in that research, what I found was that there are some theological ideas that can be manipulated and used to spiritualize and theologically legitimize abuse. And when Matt sent me the script for Control and I read it, I realized that the play contained a lot of depictions of this as well. And this is what Press Red are working towards. So in my paper, I deal with 3 examples of the intersections between domestic abuse and Christian theology. And what I decided to do, although I'm slightly now regretting it because it's going to get heavy, is that I'll speak very briefly just to each one of those. So these are ideas of male headship, which also involve the gendering of God as male, divine wrath, which is related to the torture and suffering of Christ on the cross, and finally, theodicy. Theodicy is like a kind of theological shop talk word for the way in which we kind of shift the blame for suffering away from God and onto particular groups of human beings. And we've actually mentioned blame today already. I think Siobhan and Beth both touched on this. So that's similar to what they've been talking about too. So let's start with ideas of male headship. This is based on interpretations of the Bible, as we've heard already today. So for example, in Genesis 2:18, when God creates Eve specifically to complement Adam, in the context of complementarian Christianity, in complementarian communities and understandings, primary headship roles are given to men. So we saw this in Control when Steve speaks in an aside to his marriage prep group and he says, Jesus is the head of the church. Men, you are the head of your home. The husband is the head of the wife as Christ is the head of the church. So these are really specific understandings, primary headship roles given to men, support roles to women. This is both in the context of, I think Siobhan put this really well for me earlier, I don't need to say any more about this. We're talking specifically about heterosexual marriage and complementarianism, but also more widely in the church and community. So we did hear in Control some discussions about whether women could preach or not as well. But where passages like this are interpreted literally, this can lead to really controlling and coercive behaviour. And men like Steve are emboldened by this kind of theology to have complete ownership over the lives and the bodies of their wives. In the paper, I talk about one of the women that I interviewed for my study. I refer to her as Abigail, not her real name. And Abigail was trying to be a good wife to her husband. And she talks about this. I'll let you read it. But she ended up being sexually abused, coerced, and eventually raped. And there is a further danger here with this, that when any pushback against this abuse happens, it's seen as unbiblical or defiant, or it goes against the natural order of men and women in Christian relationships. And as a result, male anger becomes something that is theologically vindicated. A second idea involves discussions of divine wrath and the torture of Christ. I've been reading a really good book called Proverbs of Ashes by Rita Nakashima-Brock and Rebecca Parker. Have some of you heard of this? Yes, excellent book. In the book, there is a woman that they talk about whose name is Lucia, and her husband is abusing her. I think he breaks her arm. He physically abuses her, and she goes to her priest to get some help with this. And she describes the reaction of the priest in this way: I should rejoice in my sufferings because they bring me closer to Jesus. The priest said, Jesus suffered because he loved us. If you love Jesus, accept the beatings and bear them gladly, as Jesus bore the cross. If you remember, this is actually echoed in Control, where Claire is talking to the marriage prep group, and she says, did Jesus feel like going to the cross? No, you'll have to imagine I'm doing it as well as Emily did it. But love held him there. Am I going to be happy every single day of my marriage? No, but love holds me there. And in both situations, this picture of Christ's suffering is manipulated, and it's used to minimize the sufferings of those, particularly in domestic abuse situations. And in fact, this way of viewing the cross and the torture of Christ encourages women to remain in an abusive setting. This is something that Matt will talk about later. They're told that to suffer is to be Christ-like. It's expected of them as good Christians, which is another very dangerous suggestion. And the third part of what I want to talk about is theodicy. Again, this idea of shifting the blame for suffering away from God and on to human beings. So we're vindicating God's role in our suffering, and we're saying it's all the people's fault instead. And in looking at this, I drew on the work in the paper of the American psychologist Tina Shermer Sellers and the epidemic of shame that she noticed in her work in the early 2000s in the USA. So she had a lot of different Christian patients come to see her about their trauma and their suffering. And a lot of them were suffering from PTSD type symptoms. So many of us will know these well: anxiety, flashbacks, physical sensations, shaking, sweating, feeling sick. And as Sellers worked with them, she found that many of her patients had actually suffered from various kinds of coercion, including domestic abuse. But what's really astonishing about this is that until they spoke to her, they hadn't actually realized that they had been in situations of domestic abuse. And yet I see a lot of nodding heads. This is quite common. And in Sellers' particular context, this is because their experiences were minimized and they were normalized within Christian teachings. So the wording that was being used around them was detracting from what was going on. And theologically, I think we can interpret this is my academic moments, 2 seconds, sorry. We can interpret this as a kind of theodicy. So shame and blame is turned back towards people who believe that they deserve this kind of treatment because they're sinful. And even more than this, theodicy reroutes domestic abuse and it presents it as something that is deserved. It's the deserved outcome, especially within what I would call soul-making theodicies, where suffering is a learning experience. There's writing on this. Suffering is a learning experience. John Hick, and it's important for spiritual development. So in that context, people think, well, I deserve it. This is right that it's happening. Oh, I'm regretting this slide now. What now? What do we do with all of this? Well, I think it's normal to feel very overwhelmed by that question. I certainly do at this moment. It's quite overwhelming to stand here today and have all of this information and to hear everybody else speaking about this and to realize again how widespread this is, how common it is as well, and how much of a problem it is in churches and religious settings. I think we've made a really good start today, and I'll say more about this in a moment, but Press Red's work on control for me has been really significant because it's a piece of theatre awareness and consciousness raising. And it's not just a play. I think it's not just a play. I think it's also a call to seek justice and to challenge these damaging theologies. It is a response to these damaging theologies that I've spoken about. In the paper, academic moment again, I talk about the contribution of trauma theology, which will come as no surprise to many of you. The concept of the middle territory is particularly what I'm interested in. This is something that comes from the work of Shelley Rambo on Holy Saturday. It's this day in between the death and resurrection of Christ, where we're just kind of sitting with everything that's happened. And I think particularly kind of visceral for all of us just now was to see Claire sort of on the ground, curled up when she had just had this abusive interaction with Steve. That moment in the middle. What I think is really good about this theologically is it holds space for us to talk about domestic abuse, because we know that those situations don't necessarily progress in linear ways. You spoke about this earlier. It's really important to underline that. There's space for understanding, and there's no rush towards creating some kind of theological or biblical meaning from what has happened. And that's really important here, particularly when what I'm trying to argue is that when theology gets into the wrong hands, it has the potential to become extremely dangerous. And there's space instead to witness, this is an important word, witness to the pain and trauma of domestic abuse. I think there's space for those within and out with those situations. So people who are still within the situations and people who we might call survivors who are moving forward on either side of this suffering. And finally, witnessing, which is what we're doing today. Providing validation, believing the stories of those who have been abused, giving empathy and support and catharsis to those who are most closely affected. It's about raising awareness. And all of the papers and discussions we've had today, I think, are just so important because the more we see what's going on, the more we can talk about it, the more we can witness to it, to use that theological word, the more we can challenge and prevent it from being caused. Thank you.
Okay, thank you, Katie, so much for that paper. And now we are going to hear from Matt. So I'll just introduce Matt here briefly. Matt Britton is an actor, writer, and theatre director. He believes drama promotes dialogue and can help as an agent for change. He was introduced to the issue of gender-based violence working as an applied dramatist for the probation service with perpetrators on domestic abuse groups. His work with Press Red, a Christian organization educating, equipping, and empowering on the issues of violence and abuse against women and girls, sees him working with young people in education, generating awareness around sexism, trafficking, and abuse within relationships. He also heads up Control, a resource of the church. Okay, thank you, Matt.
Thanks, Kirsty. Brilliant. I think I should probably start by, even though Kirsty's just said that, let me reintroduce myself. I am Matt. I am an actor playing the character of Steve. So even though I've got the same voice, I don't share the same views as Steve. So I'm not an academic. I've not got slides or anything like that. I'm an actor. So I enjoy I enjoy you looking at me. You know, actors have got a big ego, haven't they? So what I'm going to do is going to just briefly, my paper's a little bit different, but I was just asked by Kirsty in my paper just to kind of explain a little bit about the process of how we put this script together. So, well, it all started, but can I be a little bit pretentious? Let me tell you a little kind of parable style story, which illustrates, I think, why we do the play. So, there was once a homeless girl in London, and she had loads of things to share and to tell people. But London was such a busy place that nobody had time for her. And in fact, just by appearance, people were a little bit put off by her. And in fact, because she was living on the streets, she was a little bit cold, and people were kind of a bit like, oh, and stayed away from her. So she had all this stuff to say, but nobody would give her the time of day. One day, she notices in London outside like a big theatre, there's all this barriers and protective barriers, and there's like a big red carpet, and there's all people around it, and they've all got kind of cameras and microphones and everything. And she thinks, what on earth's going on here? A limousine pulls up, and outside the limousine steps this celebrity, and she's wearing this gorgeous long flowing coat, and she steps out, and as soon as she steps out of the limousine, everybody's taking the pictures of her. Everybody's got the microphone in front of her face. They want to know exactly what she has got to say. And the homeless girl is watching this, and she's getting really riled inside. So she pushes her way through all the crowd. She ducks under the barrier, and she taps the celebrity on the shoulder, and she goes, this isn't fair. I'm here every single day. I've got so much to say, and nobody gives me the time of day. You turn up in your big fancy vehicle and your big long flowing coat, and everybody's got a microphone. Everybody wants to know exactly what you've got to say. This isn't fair. And the celebrity turns and goes, you're right, it isn't fair. From now on, why don't you come around with me, and I can hide you in the folds of my coat? She goes, yeah, I'd like that. By the way, what's your name? And the homeless girl says, my name is The Truth, pleased to meet you. And the celebrity says, well, my name is The Story, pleased to meet you. And from that day on, the truth went around, wrapped up in the folds of the story. Now, I tell you that story because I think that is how we've engaged with this piece of research from Coventry University when they wrote that thing in churches too. That for some people that like reading and are literate, they love that kind of stuff. For other people in the church, it might be a little bit cold. It might be something that's just factual, and they wouldn't necessarily engage with it. So we thought our response was, let's take that research and we'll put it into the folds of a story, put the conversation up on its feet so that people are talking about it, not just those that have read it, but those can still engage with it because they've seen the play. So I'm going back to about, I think it was 2018, something like this. We put on this conference, Press Red, and we invited kind of loads of people to speak and stuff. And the patron, or the founder of Press Red at the time, Michelle Hawthorne, she knew me. She'd seen pieces of theatre that I've been in. She said, can you just put 10 minutes together that kind of illustrates or creates a picture of what we're talking about? So we did it, and it felt a bit like we'd whacked the room. So Michelle said, why don't we make it a little bit more of a full story, and we'll take it into various churches. And we did that, and we kind of had two versions at the time. So we had a version where Steve and Claire were a Christian couple. We also had a version where Steve and Claire didn't go to church or anything like that, because we were being invited into places like the Home Office. We got invited into New Scotland Yard, all these places. We had two versions. And then, of course, COVID hit and it pressed pause on any live events. So we've now, what you've just seen is a new version that we've just kind of relaunched it, because I think along the way, we were finding that we're probably losing a bit of our USP, that we were kind of talking about abuse, but not in a spiritual context. Well, because today is like abusing God, reading the Bible in the Me Too age, we rewrote it so that we're definitely getting back on message for what we felt as press read. So some of the things. So a couple of years ago, like I said before, I was first introduced with this issue as an applied dramatist on probation groups. But what I've never kind of heard about in my head was that it had happened in churches too. So Michelle at the time, she said to me, well, let me put you in contact with someone who's got a story to tell and she feels comfortable telling it. So I'm sat a couple of years ago in a coffee shop, hearing some of these things that I think I'd heard before on probation from perpetrators, but hearing it from the other side, the other perspective. Only something that was a little bit shocking to me was then the rest of it, that this was a girl who had met this lad in a Christian youth group, known him a good few years, and she was saying, a bit like what me and Katie have been talking about, that in her youth group, there was kind of lots of, I guess we would probably call it purity culture, but there was lots of conversation about, you know, keeping yourself safe and saved for marriage, but no talk about kind of sexual relationships or anything like that. And so this woman, she found herself dating this lad from the youth group. And, you know, nobody was talking about kind of other than keeping yourself safe for marriage and saved for marriage. Nobody was talking about anything wider than that. And of course, they had desires as young people. She got pregnant. And then she was kind of pretty much guided as a young person to, well, you're a Christian, you've got pregnant, so your options is to marry him. And she ended up in this relationship at a very young age with a young husband and a young child, and she found that the relationship started becoming really, really abusive, and the behavior was really, really abusive, but she didn't know any different. She just thought this is what relationships are. And in fact, this is what shocked me. She said that there'd be times when he'd do something really, really horrendous to her, and then a couple of minutes later she would go into a room and she would just sing worship songs to God. The next day in church, she said the guy that had done these horrendous things to her, he would be there at the front of church worshiping. And it was also like there was something that he was not connecting, that my behavior, and now I can just do that in front of everyone in God, in front of the church, I found really, really shocking. So we started kind of meeting up with other people with other stories. And I say for that piece of theatre, it's not actually one person's story, but it is kind of grounded and rooted in truth, because there's kind of little bits and bobs of what people have told me. But I didn't think it was right that I actually kind of just told one person's story. I thought that was too exposing. But so we took this, it happens in churches too, based it on real life stories. And I guess the other two things that, as we're creating the piece of theatre, was we looked at the Minnesota Duluth power and control wheel. So as we're kind of going through the scenes, we're thinking, right, look, almost like a tick list, that we need to have that, we need to have that, we need to have that, just so that we're kind of doing examples of it. So for example, for those of you who may be not familiar with that, the power and control wheel, it's using intimidation, emotional abuse, isolation, minimizing, denying and blaming, using children, using male privilege, using economic abuse, using coercion and threats. So without going through all those examples, you know, you can probably think of examples of when Steve was using that. So using children, you know, there was that line that he said, isn't mummy fat and boring? So he's going through that child. And you imagine, well, if they do stay together, what is that child going to pick up from hearing that kind of stuff? Using male privilege, well, we talked a bit about kind of headship and complimenting and all that kind of stuff. I would say that that feeds in our play into the using male privilege. Economic abuse. What we're not saying is that it's wrong to stay at home and look after your child, but what we are saying in our play is that the character Claire didn't want to do that, but she was coerced and kind of had a choice taken away from her because he didn't want her to have her own money, because that would restrict her freedom, make her more reliant on him. And we saw that at the end of the play, where she's actually even begging for just a little bit of money to feed her own baby. So he's controlling her there through economic abuse. The scene where it's the morning after the marital rape was basically, I thought, I wonder how many of these things that we can tick in one scene. And I set myself the challenge as a writer. Can we have at the beginning of the scene, Claire knows that she's been raped, but by the end of the scene, it's going to be her that apologizes. And I think he was using all them tactics to get her into his perspective. The second kind of little bit of text that was important to us was, have you heard of Pat Craven's Living with the Dominator? So we kind of looked at some of the archetypes that she describes, which are the bully, the head worker, the jailer, the liar, the bad father, the king of the castle, the sexual controller, the persuader. So again, we included, so the sexual controller, we included that scene of the marital rape, because Pat Craven talks about that as she was working with perpetrators on programs on probation. She was talked about, you know, she'd started to see the connection of, in war situations, how armies can invade countries and they can rape the men and women in that country because it's a way of showing your power over them. And she saw the connection that men that she was working with in their relationships were almost doing the same thing. So we kind of used that as the kind of the first moment where he really is exercising. He'd started to do it right from the beginning in more subtle ways, but this is the moment where he's really stamping his foot down. The final thing to say, I guess, is how we ended the play. So I think we didn't want it to be a play where it's kind of like it's not for entertainment's sake. The idea was to provoke a little bit of discussion and dialogue and activism. So one thing we did want to do is we wanted to role model, because this is a play that goes predominantly to churches, is that it is an option for Claire to leave the marriage. That is an option. And in fact, early on, I spoke to someone from Women's Aid about, you know, what to do with the play. And she said she was very concerned. She said, what I don't want you to do is to write a play where the church is saying you must forgive your husband, you must win him over, you must stay with him. And I thought, no, that's definitely not a message we want to be saying. But at the same time, we needed to balance it out with that. We know with the stats that actually you're most vulnerable when you're about to leave, and people that do lose their lives is normally around that moment when you are leaving. So we wanted to kind of show that as well. We don't know what Claire is going to do in the play, because in a way we're not there to provide any kind of answers. I would say that this is a two-act play, that the first act is what you see here in the room. The second act is outside of the play. That's where all the discussion and the dialogue and the questioning happens, and hopefully it begins to provoke a response, because I think we would say as Press Red, our main thing that we want with Control is to get the church to engage with this issue and work towards a safer place, work towards a better environment. And that pretty much is all I've got to say. So thank you.
Thank you, Matt, so much. And I mean, the title of Matt's paper, the Why Doesn't She Just Leave? I think you have really kind of summed it up beautifully in your paper and in the play. It's not so simple at all. So yes, and thank you, Emily. Yes. Excellent job, thank you. Right, so what I would like now to do is, there you are, I'm in front of me. I would like to ask Katie and anybody else who was going to join for this last bit for the collaboration bit, if you'd like to just come to the front.
So can we get Emily and Rosemary up as well? Oh, yes. Good.
We even have chairs for you. Okay, so at this moment we are now then we would like to hear about your collaborative efforts and how all that then went down. So the floor is yours.
Do we need a microphone? Oh, you've got it.
Oh,
do you want to go?
Oh, yes, for this.
Okay.
Yes, so many. Would you like to go first? Would you like me?
I might, so does
yeah,
somebody
you're
else
okay.
see that?
Right, so Rosemary,
Yeah, you
Yeah,
go first.
Rosemary, you can have
Just
your own mic.
Yeah. Who's going first now?
Brill, she wants to go first.
I can kick off. This was very daunting as an academic to be asked to do this collab, because I've done some work in this area, but I wasn't sure that it would really intersect with what you were kind of looking at and what you were doing with Press Red. And I think my first thought was, oh no, they're going to think I'm a stuffy academic. Oh, help. But that's not really how it works. For me, at least, I think it was really helpful. And it clarified a lot for me. I think just having a visual picture of how things work was really, really helpful, first of all. I think the other thing that I would just say is we kind of had an almost similar process, which was fascinating. So I went and interviewed women, mainly, who had been involved in coercive Christian relationships. And the kind of journey, I suppose, for me was through purity culture, but ended up being around domestic abuse, because that came into what I found so much. And so what both of us did, I think it's really important that you spoke about stories, because both of us took stories from people who had really had that experience, and that was at the center of what we were doing. And so for me, I think that was really interesting. So we had different outcomes. I've written a stuffy paper, you've done an amazing play. But it was the same, it was almost the same way of kind of going about it. So it was the same centering of voices. I think that was really, really important. I think we had some pretty common aims there. And there were two that I wrote down that I thought were common aims that we had. So you can tell me what you think of this. Please agree. The first one was, and I think you've said this just now, to kind of expose the way that Christian theology can uphold and vindicate domestic abuse. And then the second would be to kind of witness and give voice to people who have experienced it firsthand as well. Would you say that's
yeah,
yeah,
definitely. I think I was similar to you, but the other end,
Yeah.
I was, when we first got on, I thought, oh, Katie's an academic. I failed my 11 plus. What are you going to do? And I'm just an actor. But as we started talking,
Yeah,
and because
yeah.
you used to talking about purity culture, and I was thinking, what is that? And as we started talking,
Yeah.
it was very similar, wasn't it? What we were kind of had been thinking about in different ways. And I think Katie had a big influence on the rewriting of the script, because like I said, I was rewriting at the same time as we were meeting, so the premise stayed the same in the play of the church going couple and the kind of abusive tactics that he was doing, but we needed to shorten it, because it was too long. So I started to rewrite it, and all the stuff that you're talking about, like purity culture and all that, that the opening scene, which is supposed to be the wedding night that he's rushed through a wedding with Claire, was really influenced by some of the stuff that you were talking about. And I mean, there was obvious lines in there that, you know, that the vicar had been talking about, you know, keep yourself pure and all that kind of stuff. And as you were talking about that, we'd done a couple of years ago something with Natalie Collins, who's, I think, her book's there, isn't it? And she was talking about kind of all of that, you know, how we can create a culture that enables abuse and stuff. So that's how that was in the head as well. That's how that first scene really took shape.
That's amazing. I didn't know that. That's great. I think the other thing would be, for me, this, I keep using the word witnessing, which actually comes from psychology, but sounds really Bible-y. So I use it here as well, because just the idea of witnessing something changes you, doesn't it? Or hearing that story kind of changes you, or watching what you were doing earlier has such an impact on people. And so for me, as a theologian, I want to put like a fancy title on it and say, well, that's witnessing. But I think what you do is that you do that, and that's just part of how control works, right? You're sort of bringing it to people, and they're seeing what's happening, and that's going to challenge their thinking and push them into thinking about justice as well.
We invited up Emily as well,
We did.
because I just thought it might be interesting, Emily, because you're an actor going through a rehearsal process, and as an actor you need to make connections, you need to put yourself into the feet of somebody else, but you've got to feel it emotionally, haven't you, as well? So was there anything that what was your experience of rehearsing it and trying to make it real?
I mean, going back to the marital rape scene, and you know, reading the script, and she seems really clear about what's happened. I did say no, I said it twice. I think you did hear me, you know, that kind of clarity is coming through, and then all of a sudden I'm like, oh, she's just suddenly apologizing, and then suddenly saying she should say no. And so what do I need to connect there? And I remember thinking, oh, actually, you know, right at the beginning of the play, you might remember it's what's called love bombing, you know, lots of romanticizing, lots of, you know, just showering her with all sorts of gifts, and there's this real sense that for the first time she's felt really loved and valued by somebody, and there's that going back to that man. And actually, when I first read the first script that we did, I was really shell-shocked by it, because I happened to have just got engaged, and my husband is really romantic. I'm starting to think, am I being love bombed? Because I was about to move to Portugal as well. I was about to leave all my friends, all my family, and there was just this moment where I was like, Matt, I remember, like, I couldn't speak, and I was like taking it all in, and then I just had to really step out of my relationship, of the play, and just think through everything. How did I come to those decisions again? And I you know, I realized that, you know, I wasn't being manipulated, but it's just that what really helped me was imagining falling in love, and you know, being really finding somebody that just sweeps you off your feet in every way, not in just superficial like chocolates kind of way, but just like, oh, I've never felt like this before, and wanting to just hold on to that. And actually the thought of that person, that same person raping me, I must have got it wrong. Actually, that just doesn't make sense. He loves me, doesn't he? He values me. I must have got it wrong. So yeah, moments like that of remembering that foundation of, I've never felt so valued, I've never felt so loved.
And we've done like quite a few plays together in the past, haven't we? But I think in this rehearsal process, it was really kept stopping and thinking, why is he doing this? Is he is he conscious of this? Is it a decision, or is it just like it's so ingrained, the sexist, misogynistic beliefs? And it was really like starting to play with our own heads. We felt like we're being gaslighting ourselves, weren't we? And it was like, so just doing that where it doesn't actually matter because you're going away at the end of the day and you're not part of the script makes you think, wow, how difficult it must be to actually live like that.
That's right.
Rosemary, so we've got you up because I was thinking, you know, how it kind of, so this is just one of the projects we do, but how it kind of connects with other stuff that we do. And
yeah, I must admit, I saw Last Soul Control a couple of years ago, and this new version really blew me away. And it's like your Bible counseling. I mean, I've heard everything that you've said. I'm not sure a lot of us have too, said in churches and contexts, and it was just very starkly clear. And I think one of the things, I mean, Press Red, we're a Christian organization, but we work with people of all faiths, of no faiths. We don't care about people's faith, so to speak, but we do have a unique role to play in the church because we are a Christian organization. And I think my passion is the whole thing of the theology behind some of this. Because we've got this underlying theology that upholds abuse, and it becomes very clear in this play. It's not so clear maybe in some of the other things we do. We're you know, talking head on about abuse. We've got the active bystander program. We've got the leadership breakfast, which talks about all different forms of abuse, from FGM, trafficking, which we care about all of them. But I think underlying Press Red, I don't know if I'm answering your question or not. I can't even remember what the question was. Yeah, but theology is important. It counts. You've got, you know, if you've got bad roots on a tree, it's going to die, or it's going to get poisoned and poison others. So we need to get our theology right.
Yeah.
Can I just ask you, Katie, because one thing that we talked about, didn't we, in one of our first Zooms was, you know, when you're thinking these things through, at times it just becomes so heavy. And I was just wondering how you look after yourself.
What a good question. I'm a trauma theologian, so I do a lot of this. And this particular collaboration was pretty challenging, not because of anything on the part of Press Red or you. I think just the weight of that, just the weight of the topics, it's quite a lot. So I'm very fortunate. I have a really nice network of trauma theologians that I speak to and vent to, but also sometimes just stepping away from it and thinking it is really important to finish this because this does affect real people, right? It is real. It's not real, but just maybe taking a little bit of time away from it and kind of setting it down and thinking, right, what can I do that's helpful to have a bit of breathing space in all of this? And I think that's something that people need if they've been in that situation too. It's not just something that I would need as an academic. I think this rush to kind of heal and be better, like now you're on the other side, you must get better, you must forgive, we've spoken about this all day. That idea of just having space, not to maybe rush your feelings, I think is really important for me.